the Israeli government in this moment to call for a ceasefire. And sadly, our nation and our leaders have not done that. And I'm extremely disappointed, and we all are. So, why do we need to know about Palestine? What is going on in Palestine? Sister Mariam, inshallah, will go through this incredible presentation. And like I said, please share this presentation, like it. We know that, especially with social media and algorithms, they are not always interested. But if we reshare it, sometimes reshare it, make a message and a post for folks in your community and circles. Another thing you can do is share it within different groups, share the link on WhatsApps. If you want other people to know what's going on, for those especially who have been following us, this is a great opportunity. And I've actually watched Sister Mariam go through these presentations. And for someone who would say I know a lot about Palestine, actually I learned a lot. And I think many of you will do that same. So Sister Mariam, Jazakallah khairan for taking time and for all the work that you have been doing. I'm going to hand this over to you, inshallah, so you can give us this wonderful presentation, inshallah.
Great. Great, awesome. Jazakallah khair, Jelani and Care for organizing this. The foundation of everything is education. And it's not enough to just yell free Palestine. It's not just enough, to ask for a ceasefire. It's really important to educate ourselves. And as someone who's born into this Palestinian, been watching this every day, experienced it myself. Every day there's something new to learn and to understand and to, contextualize. So, I think this is really, really incredibly important. So let's jump into it. Jelani, if you could confirm everything looks okay from a slide perspective.
Yes, perfect.
All right, Bismillah. So, obviously, with the recent wave of events, it started on October 7th. And unfortunately, for many, especially in the US, especially in the mainstream narrative here in the US, we find that the timeline that they start with is October 7th. And if there's one thing that I want people to walk away from with this presentation is that there was a lot that got us to October 7th. So well before October 7th, we had an ethnic cleansing that happened in 1948. The West Bank has been under a brutal military occupation since 1967, and Gaza itself has been under a siege, a horrible siege, since 2007. So this context is really, really important for us to understand. It is the context that led to October 7th and the events since October 7th. And you cannot talk about Palestine, you cannot talk about Israel, you cannot talk about hostages, you cannot talk about ceasefire without really understanding this context. And so that's what we'll be going through today. So to make sure we're all on the same page, just want to introduce everyone, make sure we're all, understand what geographical region we're referring to. So obviously this is the map that, is historic Palestine. But typically today it's divided into three areas. There's what we refer to as occupied 48. It's also, Israel proper, what's referred to as Israel proper, what's internationally recognized as Israel. That's the light yellow here. Then we have the West Bank. This is, again, internationally recognized as an occupied territory. So Israel is occupying it. It's also typically understood as the Palestinian territory. When people talk about a Palestinian state, they point to the West Bank. Again, we'll understand kind of the implications of the West Bank and what it means to be under a military occupation. And then, of course, there is Gaza. Gaza, again, since the siege, kind of has been its own isolated area, but we'll talk about that in detail. So again, this is, occupied 48. We have the West Bank, and then we have Gaza. Those are really important to understand the geography there. The other really important thing I want to emphasize is in everything that we're talking about, really the foundation of it is Zionism. Zionism is a political ideology. It was a movement that started in the 1800s to establish a Jewish national homeland in historic Palestine. Although, interestingly, other places in the world were considered for this Jewish homeland. They settled on Palestine, and that was really the Zionist movement. And ultimately, Zionism is a settler colonial project. It aims to replace the original population of a colonized territory with a new society of settlers. And you'll see this very clearly in the presentation today. Zionism is not Judaism. Judaism is a faith, an Abrahamic faith. As Muslims, we believe and recognize that the Jewish faith and the significance of the land of Palestine to the Jewish faith. But we do want to emphasize the importance of Zionism the difference between Zionism and Judaism. Not all Jews are Zionists, and not all Zionists are Jews. And interestingly, the biggest segment of Zionists in the U.S. are actually Christian Zionists. We won't get into that today, but really, again, very important to make that distinction. And being anti-Zionist or being critical of Zionism is not being critical of the Jewish faith or anti-Semitic. The other really important thing from a terminology perspective is that you'll notice, we say the Israeli occupation of Palestine. This is not just like a two-sided war, people that can get over land. There's an occupation and an occupied, and this is in from a humanitarian international law terminology. Like, these are official terms that are used to describe. And you'll notice that we're very intentional about using the word Palestine or Palestinian. Sometimes you'll notice a lot, and you'll see in the Zionist language or even the Israeli language, they use the term Arab, and that's intentional as part of erasing the Palestinian identity, Palestinian history, saying, hey, there was no one there. Actually, these are made up people, and they can all just go to neighboring Arab countries. So that's really important to take note of whenever we're talking about this. Some of you may have seen this map, but really, I think it summarizes or captures really well the Palestinian loss of land. So you can see how Palestine was back in 1946, and over the years and over the decades, as Israel Israel was established and then continued to expand and eat up Palestinian land, and to this day continues to take over Palestinian land. You see how Palestinians are continuously pushed out of their land, and ultimately, again, this shows that it really Israel is a settler colonial project. And again, we'll go through what that means, inshallah. Now, how did we get here? We'll go back to the 1800s. This was when Palestine was under Ottoman rule. And you can see this was a census taken there. 86% of Palestine at the time was Muslim. About 10% was Christian, and then about 3% was Jewish native. And I want to emphasize there are Jewish Palestinians that were native to the land, and they lived with the Christian and Muslim populations at the time. And there was about 2% Jewish foreign-born. Now, why is this significant? Because at the time that Zionism was established, around the same time, around late 1800s, again, Zionism is a political ideology that said we wanted to establish a Jewish homeland. But in order for them to establish a Jewish homeland, they have to establish a Jewish majority. And it's very clear, right, here that you can see that there was no Jewish majority. They were definitely the minority. And so they had to come up with a plan of transfer. And these are not our words, these are words of Zionists themselves. So this is a quote from a Zionist, Vladimir Jabotinsky, who said the Arabs, and again, notice the terminology of Arab, not Palestinian, must make room for the Jews in Eretz Israel. If it is possible to move the Baltic people, it is also possible to move the Palestinian Arabs. So here you have, this is significant because you notice there's an acknowledgement of the existence of people there. So this myth that it was a land without a people for a people without a land is, Zionists themselves, prove that point wrong. They acknowledge that there were people there, and we need to do something with them in order for us to be able to achieve our, goals of establishing a Jewish homeland. Whites said it is our right to transfer the Arabs. The Arabs must go. And so, you start to see a facilitation of Jewish immigration to the land, especially in the 1930s. And then you can imagine after, the World War II and the horrible events of the Holocaust, that really help further, the Jewish immigration to the land of Palestine. Eventually, after World War II, when the UN was established, and at the time Palestine was under British rule, the British was kind of like, we don't want to deal with this anymore, because at this point there starts to be tension between the indigenous people and the people who had immigrated. Also, in the early 1900s, in the Balfour Declaration, British had provided or lended their support to the establishment of a Jewish state, and now Britain was kind of in this situation where, okay, we promised the Jewish homeland, but now the Palestinians, obviously the indigenous people aren't on board with this. We don't know what to deal with this. Here, UN, you deal with it. So the UN takes up the issue of Palestine, and they pass a resolution 181, which was a partition plan that stipulated that, okay, we think the solution is to split up the land of Palestine into two, a Jewish state and an Arab state. And at the time, the Jewish population constituted about a third of the population, but they were given the majority of the land. So right away you can see, the inequality and injustice that was committed in this partition plan that said, even though they made up the minority population, we are giving them the majority of the land. And Arabs, or the Palestinian or non-Jewish population, they were to get 42% of the land, while Jerusalem remains under international administration. Now, no one was happy with this. Even the Zionists were not happy with this. They wanted more land. Palestinians, the indigenous population, the Arabs, you can imagine, they were not happy. But again, because of the context of the world at the time, the partition plan passed, and the Zionists went into action to now put it into practice. So that led to the events of the Nakba. So the Nakba in Arabic translates into the catastrophe. For Palestinians, these are the events that officially led to the loss of Palestinian land. And so it's typically commemorated on May 15th, 1948. But it took around 2 years. And that's when Zionist militias entered into Palestinian territories, and they ethnically cleansed over 500 Palestinian villages. Over 750,000 Palestinians were driven out of their homes. Over 13,000 Palestinians were killed. This was very deliberate and systematic. It was very well planned. And I really highly encourage everyone, it's not showing up in my slide, but I really highly encourage everyone to read the book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, by a historian who's Israeli, Ilan Pappé, who goes through the plan that the Israelis and the Zionists had written out for how they were going to ethnically cleanse every village. So it was very intentional, very well planned out, and they needed to do it, again, to be able to remove the indigenous people of the land and be able to bring in their own, so that they can establish the Jewish state. Now, remember, the partition plan said they get 55% of land, but actually by the end of the Nakba, the Zionist militias had acquired 78% of the land of historic Palestine, and then Israel again declared itself as a state. So while May 15th is considered Israel's Independence Day, for Palestinians, we commemorate May 15th as a sad day. It was the day that marked the official loss of Palestinian land. And this is important because historically this has been considered the worst event in our history. But as you'll see when we talk about today's events, what's going on today in terms of numbers is actually on a scale of magnitude now comparable to the Nakba and exceeding it, actually. And so you can see images here from the Nakba. Many Palestinians left their homes not knowing they would never be able to come back. So they just, the Zionist militias entered and, they pointed at them with guns, forced them out. And the Palestinians didn't realize what was happening. So they left thinking, this is something that's temporary. We'd eventually be able to come back. But many of them to this day, actually all of them to this day that were ethnically cleansed in 1948 have not been able to return to their homes. Many of them have the keys to their homes and still have it. The original keys to their homes, they still have it. They pass it down generation to generation in hopes of being able to return. And so you can see here the map on the left. The blue is supposed to represent what was granted to the Israeli state in the partition plan. The purple represents what else they acquired on top of the blue. Again, they were given 55%, but they ended up taking 78% of the land. So those are the events of the Nakba. If we fast forward to 1967, that takes us to the Naksa. So Naksa is also more commonly known as the Six-Day War or the 1967 War or the Arab-Israeli War. And in summary, I'm not going to go into the details, but Israel basically takes the remaining 22% that they had not taken in 1948. So at this point, Israel has full control of Palestine and neighboring countries. They also took the Syrian Golan Heights as well as the Egyptian Sinai. So if you look at the map here, this is what they had. Again, this is what we refer to as Israel proper, or 1948, occupied 1948. And then the orange here is what Israel occupied in 1967. So at this point, Israel has full control of historic Palestine, including Jerusalem, and of course, Gaza and the West Bank. So what does that mean? So what does that mean for us today? So this brings us back to this map. It's created really a system where Palestinians, depending on where they live, they have certain, they live under either they live as second-class citizens in Israel or occupied 48. They live under a military occupation in the West Bank, and they live under a siege in Gaza And then we also have the Palestinian refugees that were, driven out of their homes in 1948 and out of, like, completely out of the Palestine, and to this day have not been able to return. So every Palestinian now, is impacted by the Israeli occupation and Israeli aggression. How their life is depends on which part, where they live, and literally the color of their ID. So I'm going to show a quick video here, and that summarizes really well what the different experiences are under Israeli occupation.
Israel maintains a single stratified population registry for everyone in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. At birth, Israel assigns each person an ID, and your ID determines your degree of freedom. According to Israel's 2018 nation-state law, only Jewish people have the right to self-determination in Israel. Over 50 Israeli laws discriminate against Palestinian citizens of Israel. For example, laws allowing for admissions committees can prevent Palestinian citizens of Israel from living in numerous small Jewish-only towns in Israel. After illegally annexing East Jerusalem in 1967, Israel assigned a residency ID to Palestinian inhabitants of the city, a precarious status that Israeli authorities can revoke at their discretion. Israeli planning documents for Jerusalem include an explicit goal of maintaining a Jewish majority in the city. Since 1967, Israel has revoked 14,500 IDs from Palestinians in East Jerusalem. An estimated 10,000 Palestinian children are unregistered due to the difficult process of obtaining a Jerusalem ID. In the West Bank, Palestinians carry a green ID. Palestinians with a green ID are only allowed to live on 40% of land in the West Bank. They face numerous barriers to movement and are barred from using certain segregated West Bank buses and roads designed to serve illegal Israeli settlements. Palestinians in Gaza are barred from living outside of Gaza, isolated from other Palestinian communities, and forced to live with the devastating effects of Israel's siege since 2007. Finally, millions of Palestinian refugees are excluded from the system altogether, since Israel denies their right of return.
So you can see that video really describes really well the different IDs and different systems. I just one thing I want to emphasize is Palestinians living in the West Bank are not allowed outside of the West Bank. So Palestinians living here, the green ID, they literally can't travel out unless Israel approves them for a permit. So sometimes they'll approve workers permit because they depend on cheap Palestinian labor. They may approve medical permit, but it's just as easy for Israel to deny these permits. So Palestinians really here living in the West Bank are trapped. And again, we'll cover that more. Okay. So here's an example of a Palestinian woman with her green ID. And you can't, if you ever go there, like you'll notice, every Palestinian moving around has to have their ID on them. You can't go anywhere without having your ID because your ID determines where you can go, what your rights are. And even then, for Palestinian, as hopefully you got from that video, even if you are a citizen of Israel, which is about 20% of the Israeli population are Palestinians, even then you live as a second-class citizen. There's laws that explicitly discriminate against you. So regardless of your ID, you still are experiencing some level of aggression and occupation from Israel. So occupation, what is occupation? And in this section, I'm going to focus mostly on the military occupation in the West Bank. But what does occupation look like? Part of occupation is the restriction on movement. And I think this is for many, I think the hardest to understand because, when attacks on Gaza happen, we can see the bombs, we can see the killing, we can see, the horrible images, but the restriction on movement is much harder to see from the outside. It's not until you see it for yourself or you experience it that you realize that this is one of the ways that Israel really, causes suffering for the Palestinian people. And it's almost like a slow, suffocating death for Palestinians and the Palestinian society. And so what Israel does is they have a system of checkpoints that control where you can go. You can't go anywhere really without coming up across one of these things, or many of them in many cases, a checkpoint, a roadblock, the separation wall, and again, the ID, those travel permits that you have to obtain if you want to go anywhere. So here's a picture of a checkpoint. This is a checkpoint at like 3 or 4 a.m. You might ask, why is it so busy? Because a lot of these are Palestinian workers who, again, Israel will grant them work permits to leave the West Bank because it's cheap labor for them. But then they have to come to the checkpoint so early so that they have enough time to spend 3-4 hours to get through the checkpoint so that they can get to work on time and not be fired. And they have to do this every single day. That they have to go through the checkpoint to actually get to work, and then go through the checkpoint to get back home. And I'm going to go show another video here.
اللي عمره تحت ال 45 يروح على البيت.
12 ساعة في العمل الشاق ما بيهلكوا البني آدم قد بس عملية المرور من هذا المعبر.
The video asks a question. Imagine if this was your daily life. Again, I want to emphasize this. This is daily life. Like, this is something they have to experience. Not like, once in a while when they're traveling out. Like, you saw the kids trying to get to school have to go through checkpoints. People trying to get to work have to go through checkpoints. If you're trying to access a hospital outside of the West Bank, you have to go through a checkpoint. If you're, Muslim Palestinian, you want to go to pray in Al-Aqsa, you have to go through a checkpoint or multiple checkpoints. And they are just places of pure humiliation, dehumanization, violence, aggression. Many people have been killed at checkpoints. As showed in the videos, there are days where you may show up to a checkpoint and they may decide we're not letting people under the age of 45 through, or today the checkpoint's closed. So it's a very difficult thing to be experiencing and to be experiencing daily. And when they say they are spending hours on the checkpoint, again, that is not an exaggeration. So you can imagine from a society perspective, from a daily life perspective, if you're spending 2, 3, 5 hours every day just commuting, what that does to a society, what that does to your ability to live and thrive, and build a thriving society, or good life for yourself. And so again, you see here pictures. They really do treat the Palestinians like animals in how they cage them, how they treat them. More pictures here. The other thing that Israel has put in place to restrict movement is the separation wall, or what we call the apartheid wall. This wall Israel has built around the West Bank. They claim that it's there for security, again, but it's really to trap Palestinians further within the West Bank. It's 400 miles in length, 25 feet high, and it's illegal under international law. And yet Israel still, the wall's still there. You can, if you go, you see it for yourself. And you can see in this map, this is the map of the West Bank. They built the wall, which is the red line. And actually, another thing to know is they actually built it inside what the official boundaries of the West Bank. So even with building the wall, they ate up additional Palestinian land. This is my village. So my family lives on this side of the wall, and they own and operate the businesses here. So you can imagine, before the wall, it was a straight drive into work. And now you can see this huge concrete barrier. So now they have to go around, go through a checkpoint. Hopefully the checkpoint's open, get through and go to work, and then same thing when they're going home. And I just want to emphasize, this is a bus, right? And so you can see the scale of this, size of a bus compared to the wall. When you say 25 feet high, I remember I never really understood what that meant until I saw it for myself. Just to give you further perspective, this is me, and you can see the wall compared. It's just huge, massive. It really split villages and towns. People were neighbors, and they woke up one day with a concrete barrier between them and their neighbor. For some people, it cut through their own house, so they literally one part of their house here, and maybe the land is on the other side of the wall, and it really, again, severely impairs the Palestinians' ability to move around freely. There's also a segregated road system. There's Jewish-only roads, Jewish-only buses. And this is really one of the clearest examples, one of many, but one of the clearest examples of what we call an apartheid system. So for those who are not familiar, apartheid was a term that was coined in South Africa that indicates, that there's a system that differentiates between two people based on their ethnic or religious background. And so here we have a very clear example of apartheid, and many leading human rights organizations, including Amnesty International, have come out and said that Israel is practicing an apartheid system. Again, we see it with the different IDs, we see it with the segregated roads, we see it with the fact that Palestinians living on this land are treated differently than Israeli settlers. And so this takes us to this image, which I think is really powerful. This illustrates the settlements that have popped up on Palestinian land. It's a little bit outdated. It's expanded further since 2016, which is when this video was made. But really, settlements have eaten over 40% of Palestinian land in the West Bank. Under international law, I just want to remind everyone, the West Bank is considered occupied territory, so Israel is occupying it. They occupied it in 1967. And as an occupying state, Israel, under international law, is not allowed to transfer its own population into the land that they are occupying. And yet Israel continues to do that with these settlements. Over 220 settlements and outposts have been established, and over 750,000 settlers, Israeli settlers, live on those settlements, including 60,000 American settlers. So there's 60,000 people that went from America, they have American citizenship, had no connection whatsoever to Israel other than identifying as Jewish, are able to go move and live on these settlements. These are illegal under international law. Again, even by US standards and policy, the settlements are considered illegal. And yet Israel continues to expand them. They've been expanding them for decades, and we don't see them stopping anytime soon. And the issue with settlements, number one, they're huge. Like, settlement is not like a little tent, right? They're full-blown cities. And so you can imagine if Israel is building all these settlements, number one, you're eating up a lot of land, but also Israel is building infrastructure to connect these settlements, right? Because they want to connect this settlement to this settlement. So not only is the settlement itself, taking up Palestinian land, but the infrastructure, the roads, that's how we get the segregated roads, are also further occupying Palestinian land. The other thing about settlements is that the settlers are often equipped or armed to the teeth. I mean, this is a very actually typical image for a settler. This is, again, technically a civilian. He's not part of the army officially, but he's armed like this. And this is, they're allowed to, and not only are they allowed to carry arms like this, but they are provided the arms from the Israeli government. And so Palestinians are often face aggression at the hands of Israeli settlers, from rock throwing, torching olive groves, damaging property, physical assault, and even killing. And so here you can see some Israeli settlers that are attacking a Palestinian man on his own land. In this video, I won't play the video, but that's an Israeli settler, again, civilian, technically a civilian, but armed and shoots this Palestinian man point blank. While it's not shown here in this image, but there's an Israeli soldier who's supposed to be enforcing some sort of laws, doesn't do anything to stop the settler. And one thing important, just on the note of settlements and their status internationally, a settler living on one of these settlements is tried under civilian court. Like, if they commit a crime, they're tried as a citizen of Israel. They have the right to vote. They're tried in civilian court. A Palestinian living literally right next door, if they commit a crime, they are tried in a military court. So again, a very prime example of an apartheid system. This was a farmer that was recently attacked and killed by settlers just in the recent events, and this is one of many cases. And like I mentioned, this is in the recent wave of events, the Israeli army literally went and provided settlers with arms so that they can, quote unquote, protect themselves. But really, what they're doing is trying to instill fear in the Palestinians, trying to make sure Palestinians don't try to claim back their land, and allows the settlers to continue encroaching on other Palestinian land. The other thing that Israel, practices is child detention, and especially military detention. Again, Palestinians are tried in military court, and so when Israel arrests a Palestinian child, they will be arresting them and putting them in a military detention, military court. And Israel detains and prosecutes around 700 children every single year. There's a lot here, but they typically will arrest them at night. They blindfold them. The majority of children will experience physical abuse, torture, coerced confessions. They'll have the child have to go through the legal process without the presence of a lawyer. They'll use the Hebrew language, which many Palestinian children in the West Bank don't understand. And I'll just share this video, which also really summarizes.
اسمع انا بمسك لك اياه وبروح معك عمو
في صوت خبط باقي. طلعت ان الجندي بيصحي فيه بيقول لي قم يا حبيبي تعال معي.
كان في مواجهة بعديها رحت اتفرج ما وقت الا بيطلع لي
حتى نزلوا الدكاترة وأول إشي عالجوا الكل، بعدين الأمير مسكوه وزتوه في الجيب. دخلنا أول شيء على المستعمرة وقعدت على كنت الشاشة تحتي بس كان كتر.
بلشت سياسة الضرب يعني في السيارة، يخبطوا فيا يعني لدرجة انه وجع.
بلش يقول شلح الواعي، بلش يفتش الوعية وهذا أنا مشان طلعت على البوسطة، طلعنا في البوسطة أنا مشان طلعت تقريبا 4 ساعات في البوسطة، 4 ساعات يعني جمدت صرت ثلج هذا. قعدنا هناك بعدين صار يضرب علي في حجاب وكان رايح وجاي يضرب. بعد يمكن 5 ساعات جينا وطلعنا على السوق.
بلشوا يحققوا معي يقولوا لي تعال تخافش بدناش نضربك. اعترف على شيء بسيط وبروحك يعني.
يقول لي اعترف انك بتضرب وعشان اروح. قلت له مش علي شيء عشان اروح.
أول ما بعترفتش طلعت طويل وضخم لو بضربني على رجلي فعودت اعترفت حجر.
عملوا انا يعني الاشي الصعب هذا البني ادم، فاضطر انه يصير يضربني. مسكني من راسه وخبط راسي في الطاولة ضربني هنا بوكس على بطني.
استخدم الضغط النفسي أكثر شيء. بعد كده باخذ أخوك بجيب أهلك بهد الدار بسوي أي شيء. حياة الطفل الفلسطيني طبعا كلها خوف وذل وقهر وكل شيء يعني يتعلق التعليم كل ذل وقهر. يعني شعور بالنسبة للشعور هو شعور مأساوي، بتحس أولادك يعني مميزين، يعني حتى بتحس إنهم بينهاروا قدامك ومش قادر تعمل لهم شيء. شعور لا يوصف.
So I think that that video really captures well the violence that Palestinian children face when they're arrested and throughout the interrogation process. And one thing maybe that wasn't mentioned explicitly is you can imagine these kids when they're arrested, even they're missing school. Many of them are held for weeks, if not months, if not years at a time, and so it really is disruptive to their ability to continue their studies. Many of them may end up dropping out or may not be able to even continue school with the psychological trauma that they've gone through. And so it's a way, again, like of crippling a society. You know, you cripple them by limiting their movement, you cripple them by hurting them with their children, by, you know, instilling in them fear and trauma that makes it very difficult for them to live fulfilling and thriving lives. More broadly speaking, Israel not only arrests children, obviously they do arrest adults. There's over 7,000 Palestinians in Israeli custody. 88 of them are women, 250 of them are children. That's like currently in custody, but as you saw in the video, Israel arrests and prosecutes 700 a year. So they may not necessarily stay in there for a full year, but these are current numbers. 1,300 of them are in administrative detention. Really important to understand this. Administrative detention is a practice that Israel uses to keep people in their custody without ever charging them with anything or giving them a trial. So they'll bring someone in, they'll put them under administrative detention, which is 6 months. And by 6 months, they're supposed to, you know, charge them with something, let them know, hey, this is why we're holding you. But what Israel does is that they will renew the administrative detention. So 1,300 Palestinians are under this really, you know, violent practice of keeping people without charge or trial. And since October 7th, over 3,000 Palestinians have been arrested. And generally speaking, 4 out of 10 Palestinian men will spend some time in Israeli jail. So it's a practice that impacts Palestinian society broadly. And like I said, these Palestinians are being tried in military court. So really, really difficult, difficult process, and I think the conviction rate is like 99%. So, usually they will either force a confession or convict. And it's very hard to really get justice within the military Israeli courts. One thing I want to note that 2023, this was before October 7th, human rights organizations came out and said 2023 was the deadliest year on record for Palestinian children. And this is important, again, because, just going back to the beginning of my presentation, that well before October 7th, Palestinian children were being killed, they were being detained, they were living under military occupation. And 2023 especially has been a very, very violent year for Palestinians. You can see in the West Bank alone, 192 Palestinians were killed before October 7th, including 40 children, again, the deadliest year on record. And since October 7th, since just the last couple of weeks, another 200 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank alone, including 52 children. So we're not even talking about Gaza yet. You can see that although Israel tries to keep the focus on Gaza and Hamas in Gaza and whatnot, really the Israeli aggression has really spanned in the entirety of the Palestinian experience, no matter whether it's in Gaza, whether it's the West Bank or occupied 48, and this has been going on for decades. So just to summarize, West Bank, again, is under a brutal military occupation. It's been there for decades. Israel uses the practice of arrests and military detention. They do, they carry out regular raids on refugee camps. They typically go in at night, and very brutal, very aggressive. I could do a whole presentation just on these, but again, I just want everybody to understand that even living in the West Bank, not in Gaza, Palestinians are living under this brutal military occupation. Like I said, they're also facing the Israeli settler attacks and killing, regular killing. And all of this has only escalated since October 7th. So the scale of it has escalated. Now we go to Gaza. So Gaza, again, context is important. How we got here is important. So Gaza has been under a full blockade since 2007. Right, so over 16 years of blockade. What does that mean? That means Israel controls, until obviously these events, Israel wasn't inside Gaza. They controlled Gaza from land, sea, and water. They controlled everything and anything that entered. There was actually a report, I believe in 2008, that documented how Israel counts the number of calories that go into Gaza because they just wanted enough to maintain the population without allowing them, obviously, to thrive. The conditions in Gaza have been really, really difficult for many years. 97% of the water is unfit for drinking, 50% unemployment rate, one of the highest in the world. They receive about 4 hours of electricity every day. And up until this assault, they had experienced 4 major military assaults since 2008. The UN came out, I believe, in 2012 and said Gaza would be unlivable by 2020. right? So again, this is really important to understand. Gaza was already a very difficult place to be living. It was a humanitarian disaster, from a living perspective, but also the military aggressions. So I'll play a quick video here as well, or maybe I guess I don't have the video, but just for context, a child that was born in 2007 has at this point, counting this latest events, has gone through 5 wars, 5 military aggressions, and you can imagine the impact on them psychologically. There was a psychologist that came out and said there is no PTSD in Gaza because there's no post, right? Because Palestinians, and especially those in Gaza, are continuously living it. They have not gotten past it. They have not been able to get past it. Gaza is one of the most densely populated places in the world. I know in an earlier video it said 1.6 million, because that's a little bit, it was from a few years ago, but now the population is about 2.1. We've seen estimates of 2.3. So one of the most densely populated areas in the world. As I said, they've experienced 4 military assaults before this one. Just to give everyone perspective, the most brutal of those assaults before this one was the one back in 2014. It was called Operation Productive Edge. Israel named it that. And in that assault, around 1,400 civilians were killed, including 550 children. And this is the worst one we had seen up until these events. And these are images from 2014. And I share this because they're very similar images to what we're seeing today, right? So what Israel is doing today is not new. It had carried out these operations. There's a term called mowing the lawn. So Israel basically mows the lawn every few years. It comes in and creates mass destruction, mass killing to keep the Gaza population, contained, to keep them under this brutal siege, this brutal, way of living, so that they make it difficult for them to be able to do anything or to go anywhere, because ultimately Israel's plan, and we see this from their, what's happening today, is to take over Gaza. So again, these are images from 2014. You can see they're very similar to the images from today. There's this, I don't like to just share numbers without sharing certain stories, just to humanize. There was a case in 2014 of the Becker boys. There were 4 boys, cousins, that were playing on the beach, and they were killed. And this was documented. There was images of this. Israel killed the 4 boys while they were playing soccer on the beach. And until this day, no one has been held accountable. And of course, these are just 4 boys from many others that had been killed by Israel. For the sake of time. So all of this had happened in Gaza since before October 7th. So since October 7th, after the attacks on Israel, obviously we've seen the recent events unfold. And I want to start with this video. Shows Israel's intent and what they plan to do with Gaza.
את אשר עשה לך עמלק נצטווינו. אנו זוכרים ואנו נלחמים.
This is the Prime Minister of Israel.
It's an entire nation out there that is responsible. It's not true. This rhetoric about civilians not aware, not involved, it's absolutely not true.
אין חשמל, אין מזון, אין מים, אין דלק. הכל סגור. אנחנו נלחמים בחיות אדם ואנחנו נוהגים בהתאם.
Very puzzled by the constant concern which the world is showing for the Palestinian people, and is actually showing for these horrible, inhuman animals who have done the worst atrocities that this century has seen.
עזה לא תחזור להיות מה שהייתה, וחמאס לא יהיה. חסל את הכל.
مع هيك وحوش بشرية رايحين نتعامل كيف لازم. إسرائيل فرضت إغلاق كامل على غزة.
هناك إسرائيليون وصفوا الفلسطينيين في غزة، وصفوهم بأنهم حيوانات، بل أقل من حيوانات.
أنا لا أسويهم بالحيوانات لأن هذا تحقير للحيوانات.
هذا رأيك دكتور مردخاي؟
نعم، هذا رأيي.
تكسخوا אותם כמה שיותר, שלא להשאיר מהם זכר. שלא הם, לא אמא שלהם, לא הילדה שלהם, לא התינוקות שלהם. אסור להם לחיות לחיות האלה. אתה יש לך שכן ערבי, אתה לא תחכה שהוא יבוא אליך הביתה. תיכנס אליו הביתה ותירה.
תראה, לצורך
לא, אתה חושב שאנחנו יכולים להרוג מאות אלפי פלסטינים ברצועת עזה, והדבר הזה יעבור?
תראה, עכשיו בתקשורת הזרה יוצאת הודעה בשם ישראל שמיליון פלסטינים כבר ירדו מדרום הרצועה דרומה, וכל מי שנשאר שם נחשב כמחבל.
תשמיד את עזה עכשיו, עכשיו. עזה הופכת לדרזדן, כן.
הארץ שלנו, כל הארץ, כולל עזה, כולל הלבנון, כל הארץ המובטחת. אנחנו קוראים
אנחנו אור לגויים.
So what that video illustrates, I mean, these are statements from Israeli officials, government officials, and you can see the language that they're using, right? Referring to Palestinians as human animals, being very explicit about their plans for Gaza, you know, cut off fuel, cut off food, cut off water, annihilate Gaza, destroy Gaza, everybody is a target, everybody is a terrorist. And ultimately, you know, as was, you know, by the statements, is we want Gaza's ours, you know, the land is ours. So again, you know, it fits this ultimate plan, the settler colonial plan to take over Gaza and take over the Gaza land. So Israel's been very clear, and I think this is really important, especially as Americans, to understand that Israel has been really clear about their intentions and their plans for Gaza, very clear about what they plan to carry out and are actually carrying out with Gaza, how they view the people of Gaza and Palestinians more broadly. And it's really important to recognize, you know, in international law, or like in humanitarian studies, to genocide is the hardest part about proving a genocide is to prove genocidal intent. And yet in this case, we have so many clear examples in the words that these Israeli officials are using, that they plan to carry out ethnic cleansing, they plan to carry out a genocide, and we've seen it, right? It's not just, obviously not just words, it's been actions, as we've seen in the last few weeks. These are the numbers. These numbers, like, no matter how much I update the slides, they're always going to be outdated. But as of last time updated a few hours ago, over nearly 15,000 Palestinians have been killed, over 6,000 children and 4,000 women. Again, the majority of those killed have been civilians, over 6,000, you know, children, and thousands missing under the rubble. So you can see images here. Again, similar images to what we saw in 2014 and 2008 and 2012. So this is Israel doing it again, but obviously the scale of this has been unprecedented. This is certainly the worst aggression we've seen on Gaza. And if you remember the numbers, if I go here, remember the numbers of the Nakba, you know, it was about 15,000 killed, 750,000 displaced. At this point in Gaza, over 1 million Palestinians, around 1.4 is estimated, have been displaced from their homes. As you can see, we're getting very close to 15,000. And a lot of these numbers, you know, are because of Israel's attacks on the infrastructure, especially the healthcare system. It's been hard for Palestinians to even update their numbers. So we expect this number to rise significantly in the weeks to come. Very difficult images that we see. I mean, this is, I think, an image that's going to go down in history. This is a press conference by the doctors, you know, with bodies, and it's a very graphic image, but you know, that's the level of aggression, and the Palestinians want the world to see, like, this is what's happening, and this is what the world is allowing to happen to us. You know, I shared this image. This is when Israel. So Israel has come out and said, you know, Palestinians, you know, you need to leave the north of Gaza and go to the south. And again, these images remind us of the images from the Nakba that I shared earlier. But what's really, really important for people to understand here is that although Israel says they, you know, the south is safe, like, people need to migrate. First of all, telling someone that they need to leave their house, like, even if Israel warns people and even if Israel tells people or gives them a chance to leave their house, that is still unjust. That is still unethical, right? if someone comes to your house and says you gotta leave, right? Even if they gave you a warning and actually let you leave, that's still you being kicked out of their homes. That is still ethnic cleansing. So that's really important to understand. The other thing that's really important to understand is actually the South is not safe, as Israel claims to say. 49% of those who have been killed in the last couple of weeks have been from the South. Over 1,000, probably now closer to 2,000 or 3,000 that have been killed were people who had migrated from the north to the south. And so this idea that Israel has created a safe place for people to go to is not true. And for the people that do choose to move from the north to the south, we have many documented cases and images and videos of them being attacked in what is so-called, what they call the humanitarian corridor that Israel has established. So, for those who did heed the call from Israel to leave and to, quote unquote, evacuate, Israel is shooting them, attacking them, not letting ambulances get to them, to treat them. And so really there is no safe place in Gaza for anybody, whether it's in the north or the south. This image came out in the early days of the recent aggression, and the journalist who took it, Rushdie Sarraj, was actually killed by Israel a few days later. The image went viral, and people were shocked, I think, to see, because the image captures so well the level of the scale of the aggression. And we see that Israel intentionally has been targeting journalists. We know this because over 40 journalists have been killed. Not only that, Israel calls journalists. They literally call them on the phone and will threaten them. They'll, tell them their name. They'll tell them their spouses and their kids' names, and they'll tell them, if you don't leave, we're going to target you. And so many journalists, and this is again intentional by Israel because they don't want the images and the videos to come out of Gaza. They target the journalists' families. Wa'il al-Dahdouh, a very prominent journalist with Al Jazeera, just a few days after Blinken from the US, told Al Jazeera they need to tone it down in their reporting. Israel killed Wa'il Dahdouh's wife, 2 kids, and grandchildren, and he was ultimately forced to leave his home. So we see a targeting of not just the journalists, but the journalists' families. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinian homes are either partially or completely demolished, unlivable. And like I said, 1.4 million Palestinians now have been displaced within Gaza. Again, the population of Gaza is 2.3, right? So that's the majority of Palestinians now have been displaced. Over 40, actually this number is outdated. The last I saw was 800, forgive me, but over 800 Palestinian families have been wiped off the civil registry. This is a term that I think I didn't register for a while. Like, what does that even mean? What that means is that Israel killed the grandparents, the parents, and the kids. There's no one left in the family, in the lineage of the family. And so hundreds of Palestinian families have been wiped off of the civil registry. There is no one even to bury the bodies of the family. There's no one there to receive the condolences. And this has been happening over and over and over again in this latest assault. You can see on the right, this is a picture of one family. 44 members of just one family were killed, ranging from ages of, I believe the youngest was 40 days, up to 87 in age. Again, very difficult images that we see. This is an image that has just been repeated over and over again. This family, everybody in this picture was killed by Israel. And actually, this is a family of one of our sisters and community members here in Minnesota, Sister Manal, lost over 30 members of her family in Gaza. Again, one of those cases of families being wiped out. And Minnesota alone, Palestinian families have lost over 80 members of their family in this latest aggression. Raz Siegel, he's an Israeli historian. He's an expert on Holocaust and genocide studies. He's come out and said this is a very clear case of genocide that's taking place. The other thing that's been kind of really that we've seen in the latest assaults is the Israeli attacks on hospitals. I mean, this is probably one of the most egregious crimes we've seen. Hospitals are protected under international law. They should not be attacked, and yet we've seen a large scale of attacks on hospitals. Most of the hospitals in Gaza at this point have stopped functioning completely, and for those who remain functioning, very low capacity. Because they have no fuel, because they are not getting resources and supplies. Over 200 healthcare workers killed. Shifa, which many of you maybe have heard about in the news, the biggest medical center in Palestine, in Gaza, was directly attacked, directly hit. Israel literally has taken over the Israeli military. They went in. Number one, they stole bodies that had been killed, and the staff weren't able to bury them because Israel had surrounded the hospital. So Israel stole the bodies. Eventually, they arrested some of the healthcare workers and ultimately forced everyone out of the hospital, except for patients who literally physically could not be moved. And just yesterday, I believe, the head of the Shifa hospital has been arrested by Israel, and no one really knows where he is. And this was after he was being transported by a UN coordination. So we're seeing a very targeted attack on the hospitals. Israel claims that there is Hamas bases under the hospitals, and yet they have not been able to provide sufficient evidence to prove this. And we see this with multiple hospitals, not just the Shifa. We see Rantisi. We saw an attack on a cancer department. We saw attacks on a hospital that specializes in care for the elderly. Earlier in these events, we saw the attack on Ahli Hospital, which is in one attack killed 500 Palestinians. Again, we see targeting of ambulances illegal under international law. This is a nurse receiving news at the hospital of his family being killed, and over 200 healthcare workers themselves have been killed by Israel since the beginning of these events. And you can see this is November 10th. It's just so hard to update the numbers because they're constantly changing. This was a doctor who was working in the north. Israel told him to evacuate. He refused. He actually did an interview with American media, and they asked him, why don't you leave? Israel's giving you a chance to leave. And he says, do you think this is the reason I went to med school? To think only about my life and not my patients? A few days later, on November 12th, Israel killed him and his family. Let's see how we're doing on time. I won't play this video, but many people the premature babies. I mean, this was something.
You're good. You can take your extra time. We're fine. Keep going.
Okay, sure. Let's play this then.
They are now lying on the floor in the cardiac unit, and they are covered with some blankets in order to avoid hypothermia. These babies should have been, they should have been in the incubators, of course, and they are surrounded by Israeli armed forces who are shooting at the hospital. We learned this morning, snipers were shooting through the windows and into the staff. We also learned that one nurse was killed in the neonatal ICU.
Honestly, today when I spoke with the Red Cross, literally they told me that they have suspended their operations in Gaza and they have no news about Mira and the hub. No news at all. I don't know whether they are all right or not. Honestly, this is something you cannot describe when you reach to such a point where you can't provide safety to your newborn children.
The staff of the Shifa hospital has requested that tomorrow we will help the babies in the pediatric department to get to a safer hospital.